The hunters were an unlikely bunch. There was Dave, a retired mechanic who had spent most of his life wrenching on rusty Fords in some dingy garage. There was Lisa, a stay-at-home mom who had once harbored dreams of becoming a marine biologist but had settled for changing diapers instead. And then there was Tom, a middle-aged man who had worked at a convenience store for the past 3 decades and could tell you the exact price of a pack of cigarettes at any given moment in history. But today, they were all here in the depths of the Cascade Range, their hearts pounding with excitement and fear as they set out to hunt down a Sasquatch. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the pungent scent of pine needles and damp earth. The sun barely peeked through the dense canopy of trees, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. Dave, their leader, gestured towards a nearby clearing. "All right, everyone," he said in a hushed voice. "This is where we saw it last." The others nodded in agreement, their eyes scanning the treetops warily. Lisa, who had never fired a gun in her life, fingered the rifle she had borrowed from her husband. It felt heavy and unwieldy in her hands, but she was determined to prove herself. Tom, on the other hand, seemed to be having second thoughts. He kept glancing over his shoulder, as if he expected something sinister to be lurking behind him. But no one else was around. The forest was eerily quiet, save for the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustle of leaves in the wind. Dave motioned for them to follow him deeper into the clearing. "There," he whispered, pointing to a huge pile of leaves and twigs at the base of a tree. "That's where we think it sleeps during the day." The others exchanged nervous glances. They knew that getting too close would be risky, but they had come too far to turn back now. Slowly, they crept forward, inching their way through the underbrush. The air grew thick with tension as they neared their target. Suddenly, there was a loud crashing sound from somewhere nearby. The hunters froze in their tracks, hearts pounding. Was it the Sasquatch, or just a startled animal? They strained their ears, listening intently for any further signs of movement. Time seemed to stand still as they waited, barely daring to breathe. And then, from out of nowhere, a huge, hairy figure emerged from behind a nearby tree. Its eyes locked onto them, and for a brief moment, they were face to face with the legendary creature itself. "It's huge," Lisa whispered, her voice trembling with fear and awe. The Sasquatch stood at least 8 feet tall, with fur the color of damp earth and eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. Its muscles rippled beneath its fur as it took a step forward, revealing massive, clawed feet. Dave, his heart racing with adrenaline, raised his rifle and took aim. But before he could fire, the Sasquatch let out an ear-splitting scream that seemed to echo through the trees for miles around. Within moments, more figures began to emerge from the woods, joining the first one. There were more Sasquatches than they had ever imagined possible. "We have to get out of here," Tom shouted, his voice cracking with fear. The hunters turned and began to run, their feet pounding against the forest floor as they tried to escape the onslaught of the enraged creatures. But the Sasquatches were fast, and they soon began to gain ground. Soon, the hunters were surrounded, trapped in a circle of furious beasts that seemed to grow larger with each passing moment. Lisa glanced back over her shoulder, her eyes wide with terror. "We can't outrun them," she gasped. "We're doomed." Dave, his face etched with determination, stopped in his tracks. "No," he said, "we're not." And with that, he raised his rifle once more and took aim at the lead Sasquatch. The others followed suit, firing their weapons in a deafening barrage that sent the Sasquatches staggering back. The hunters didn't stop there. They continued to fire, unleashing a hail of bullets that tore through the air and ripped into the furry bodies of their attackers. Blood splattered onto the leaves and trees, painting the forest floor with a gruesome red. The Sasquatches howled in pain and fury, but they couldn't match the firepower of the determined hunters. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the last of the Sasquatches fell to the ground, its lifeless body slumping lifelessly against a tree. The hunters paused for a moment, catching their breath and surveying the carnage around them. Blood dripped from the trees and pooled on the ground, a chilling reminder of the brutal battle they had just fought. Dave looked at his companions, a mixture of pride and horror in his eyes. "Well," he said, his voice shaking, "I guess that's one Sasquatch we can cross off the list." No one responded, they were too busy trying to process what had just happened. But deep down, they all knew that this was just the beginning. The legend of the Sasquatch was far from over. Lisa, her hands shaking uncontrollably, took a step back and surveyed the carnage. The bodies of the Sasquatches were twisted and torn, their fur matted with blood. She couldn't help but feel a sense of awe and respect for these creatures, even as she knew they had been forced to fight for their survival. "I never thought it would come to this," she murmured. Tom, still pale from shock, forced himself to kneel beside one of the Sasquatches. He reached out tentatively, running his fingers through its fur. "They're so big," he whispered. "And so strong. I don't think any of us expected that." The others nodded, their expressions grim. They knew that the battle had changed all of them, forever. As they began to collect themselves and gather their belongings, a sense of unease settled over the group. They knew that their actions had probably brought even more attention to themselves and their presence in the forest. And with each passing moment, the danger of discovery grew more and more real. They would have to move quickly and silently if they were to escape the wrath of the Sasquatches and whatever other threats might be lurking in the shadows. Finally, Dave spoke up. "All right," he said, his voice firm. "We need to bury these bodies. We can't leave them here for the animals to find. And we need to get out of here before we're spotted." The others nodded in agreement, their faces set in grim determination. Together, they began the grisly task of disposing of the evidence that would link them forever to the legend of the Sasquatch. As they worked, they couldn't help but feel the weight of what they had done pressing down upon them. The forest seemed to grow darker and more ominous with each passing minute, as if aware of the blood that had been spilled on its sacred ground. Lisa found herself shivering uncontrollably, her hands trembling as she struggled to bury the bodies deep enough. Tom, his face pale and drawn, paused for a moment to wipe sweat from his brow. "I can't believe we're doing this," he muttered. "I mean, we just killed them. They were innocent creatures, just trying to survive like us." No one answered, they were all too busy wrestling with their own guilt and confusion. Finally, after what seemed like hours, they finished their gruesome task. Dave surveyed the freshly dug earth one last time, then turned to face his companions. "All right," he said. "Let's get out of here." They began to pick up their gear, hurrying through the forest in silence. The air was thick with tension, and they knew that they would have to remain vigilant if they were to make it out alive. As they walked, Lisa found herself studying the faces of her companions, trying to read their expressions. She could see the fear in Tom's eyes, and the determination in Dave's. But there was something else there, too. Something that she couldn't quite put her finger on. A sense of loss, perhaps. Or maybe it was guilt. Or maybe it was simply the realization that, from this moment on, their lives would never be the same. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, a dark and foreboding place where anything could happen. And as they trudged through the underbrush, they knew that they were not only fighting for their survival, but also for their very souls. The Sasquatches might be gone, but the legacy of what they had done would haunt them for the rest of their days.